Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're taking a close academic look at something quite foundational, the competing nationalisms in Palestine, right up to 1948.
And specifically, how these nationalisms really shaped the outcome of the war that year. It's a complex period, stretching from the late Ottoman era right through 48.
Exactly. Our mission, if you like, is to trace how these two movements, Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism, or Zionism, developed, and crucially, how their clash influenced what actually happened on the ground.
It's important to say up front, though, that they weren't always seen as completely incompatible, at least not initially. You had Arab nationalism growing, part of this wider Arab awakening against first Ottoman control and then later Western influence.
Right.
And then Zionism emerging in Europe, largely a response to anti-Semitism, seeking a national home for Jews in Palestine. The core issue became, well, the focus on the same piece of land.
Okay, so let's kick things off in that late Ottoman period. What were the sort of early signs of this brewing conflict?
Well, you start seeing Arab nationalism taking shape in the late 19th century. Palestinian Arabs began identifying more with this larger Arab nation seeking independence. Rashid Khalidi talked a lot about this.
Okay.
At the same time, Zionism is gaining steam in Europe. The push for a Jewish national home in Palestine becomes more urgent because of rising, often violent anti-Semitism.
And this wasn't just theoretical, right? There was movement on the ground.
Precisely. You have the first Aliyah, the first big wave of Jewish immigrants, starting around 1882. And organizations like the Jewish Colonial Trust were set up to buy land.
Which inevitably caused some friction.
Yes, it did lead to some early tensions. Some Arab farmers were displaced by these land purchases, creating resentment. It's also interesting, you see the term Palestinian or Philistini starting to pop up in Arabic writing around the 1890s.
So a distinct identity is starting to form, even if people also saw themselves as Ottoman or part of a larger Arab identity.
Exactly. It was developing alongside those other identities. The Ottomans, for their part, they did try to put some limits on Jewish immigration and land sales. They saw the potential trouble.
But it wasn't very effective.
No, largely not. Corruption was an issue, and the empire's control was weakening anyway. By 1914, just before the war, the numbers give you a sense of scale. Maybe 60,000 Jews, about 8% of the population, compared to around 683,000 Arabs.
That demographic picture is stark. Okay, fast forward past World War I, and we enter the British Mandate period. This seems like a real accelerator.
Oh, absolutely critical. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 is, well, pivotal. Britain basically promises support for a Jewish national home in Palestine.
But didn't they also make promises to the Arabs about independence?
That's the crux of it, yes.
Wow.
During the war, through the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, they'd made promises suggesting Arab independence. These two things were fundamentally at odds.
A classic contradiction.
And it's so deep distrust. The Arab population felt betrayed, fueling resentment towards both the British and the Zionist project. It really poisoned the well from early on.
So how did this play out practically during the Mandate years? More conflict.
Yes, and accelerated efforts on the Jewish side to build the foundations of a state. The Haganah, a defense force, was formed in 1920. The Jewish agency became incredibly important politically, economically.
Building institutions.
Exactly, state building in practice. And the Jewish population grew significantly, up to about 30% by the mid-1930s. On the other side, Palestinian Arab opposition solidified. Figures like Haj Amin al-Husseini became central voices against Zionism.
And this led to violence.
It did. You had riots in 1920, 1921, then the Hebron massacre in 1929, often triggered by disputes over land or holy sites. It kept escalating.
Until the Arab Revolt.
The Arab Revolt of 1936, 1939 was a major large-scale uprising against British rule and against Zionist immigration. It was a defining moment.
But it was suppressed.
Brutally suppressed by the British. Thousands of Palestinians were killed, imprisoned, or exiled. The Palestinian political leadership was decimated. It was a devastating blow to their national movement.
That sounds like a critical turning point. One side weakened significantly.
While the other, the Jewish community and its institutions, arguably consolidated. They had to defend themselves during the revolt, and their military capacity grew, sometimes even with tacit British support against the Arab fighters.
It's a real asymmetry emerging there.
Definitely. And then ironically, the British issued the 1939 White Paper, trying to appease Arab anger by restricting Jewish immigration. But that just ended up infuriating the Zionists. British policy was just full of these contradictions.
Okay, let's move into the World War II era and its immediate aftermath. How did global events shift things in Palestine?
World War II, and especially the Holocaust, had a massive impact. Global sympathy for the Zionist cause grew enormously. The demand for Jewish immigration to Palestine as a safe haven became intense, even with British quotas still in place.
Did the dynamic with the British change?
Yes. Zionist militias, like the Irgun, stepped up actions against the British. The King David Hotel bombing in 1946 is a major example. Britain was weakened by the war, facing this escalating violence, and frankly, they wanted out.
So they turned to the UN.
Correct. They handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. They just couldn't manage it anymore.
Which brings us to the UN Partition Plan, Resolution 181.
Yes, 1947, the UN proposed dividing Palestine. A Jewish state would get about 55% of the land, an Arab state about 45%, and Jerusalem would be internationalized.
How was that received?
Critically different reactions. The Zionist leadership accepted it, reluctantly perhaps, given the borders, but they saw it as the best path to statehood.
And the Arab side?
Utter rejection. Palestinian Arabs and the wider Arab world saw it as fundamentally unjust. Partitioning their homeland without their consent, it was unacceptable.
So acceptance versus rejection, that seems like the immediate trigger for war.
It absolutely was. That fundamental disagreement set the stage. As soon as the UN vote happened, violence escalated rapidly. You entered what historians called the Civil War phase, 1947 into early 48. Intense fighting between Jewish and Arab communities.
And this is when Plan Dalet comes into play.
Yes. Plan Dalet, or Plan D, it was a strategic military plan by the Haganah, the main Zionist force. The goal was to secure the areas allocated to the Jewish state by the UN, plus strategically important areas beyond those lines, and Jewish settlements.
And the consequence?
A major consequence was securing territory, but also the mass displacement of Palestinian Arabs. Cities like Haifa, Jaffa. Large numbers of Palestinians fled or were expelled during these operations.
Then came the formal declaration.
May 14th, 1948. David Ben-Gurion declares the independence of the State of Israel, grounded, in this idea of Jewish self-determination after centuries of persecution.
And the Arab states reacted immediately.
The very next day, armies from neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, invaded, aiming to crush the new state.
But the outcome wasn't what they intended. Why?
Well, a key factor was organization and unity, or the lack thereof. The Arab armies were often poorly coordinated, driven by different national interests and rivalries, without a clear, unified strategy.
Compared to the Israeli forces?
Compared to the Israeli forces, yes, which were becoming more unified under Ben-Gurion's leadership. They were generally better organized, highly motivated, fighting for survival on familiar ground, and had clearer strategic goals. That difference was critical.
And a result of the war.
By the time the fighting stopped in 1949, Israel controlled about 78% of what had been Mandate Palestine, significantly more than the UN partition plan had allocated.
And for the Palestinians?
For Palestinians, this is the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 people displaced, becoming refugees, hundreds of villages destroyed, a national trauma that created a lasting refugee crisis in Gaza, the West Bank, and neighboring countries.
It's clear these weren't just political disagreements. The underlying ideologies were powerful drivers. Can you unpack those a bit?
Sure. If you look at Zionist thought, Herzl, the founder, envisioned a progressive state, maybe even benefiting Arabs. But others, like Ahad Ha'am, were more cautious, warning early on about ignoring the existing Arab population and the potential for resistance.
And Ben-Gurion's approach?
Ben-Gurion was very pragmatic, very focused on achieving Jewish sovereignty and security above all else. This often meant downplaying or dismissing Palestinian national rights.
And on the Palestinian side, how did their nationalism evolve?
It grew from a more general anti-Zionism and desire for Arab independence into a distinct Palestinian identity, especially forged through the experience of conflict and, later, displacement. Figures like al-Husseini were important in mobilizing people, though his wartime alignment with Nazi Germany is obviously deeply controversial and complex.
And the Nakba cemented this identity.
Profoundly. After 1948, Palestinian identity really coalesced around that shared experience of loss, statelessness, the right of return. It became central.
You mentioned asymmetry earlier. How did that play out ideologically and practically?
It's crucial. The Zionist movement was incredibly effective at building the institutions of a state before 1948. The Jewish Agency, the Histadrut Trade Union Federation, the Haganah, these were proto-state bodies. Very proactive.
Whereas Palestinian nationalism?
While deeply felt, it was often more reactive. It was hampered by internal splits like the rivalry between the powerful Husseini and the Nashashibi families, and critically weakened by the British suppression of the Arab Revolt, which wiped out much of its leadership just years before 1948.
And you're saying this difference in preparedness and institutional strength directly impacted the 1948 outcome.
Absolutely. It's a direct link. The Zionist movement entered the conflict with functioning political, administrative, and military structures. The Palestinian Arabs and the invading Arab states were far less prepared, less unified.
So you have these clashing narratives too. Zionism as liberation for Jews, Palestinian nationalism as resistance against dispossession.
Exactly. Two deeply held national narratives, fundamentally opposed over the same land, leading directly to the events of 1948.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it seems undeniable that these competing nationalisms weren't just ideas. They were the engines driving events, profoundly shaping the lead up to 48 and the war's results.
Precisely. And the capacity of each movement, their ability to build institutions, mobilize effectively, maintain unity that played such a crucial role in determining who achieved their goals.
It really highlights the tangible impact of nationalist movements.
Indeed. And it leaves us with a thought, doesn't it? How the echoes of 1948, the legacies of these competing claims and the trauma of that period continue to reverberate today. It really makes you consider how deeply history shapes the present in that region, influencing the ongoing struggles for identity, land, and self-determination.